to begin very shortly.
Here it is. Okay.
This next speaker, I'm actually a bit familiar with him because I have seen your software. And I saw it demonstrated, and it is so cool. It is. It's incredible what he's done with his software in ethics. So I'm looking forward to the presentation. That's all I'm going to say. Fulvio, it's all yours. I want to take your time. Okay? Go for it.
Well, I mean, to be sure, I didn't write any software. I'm not an expert in computer science. I'm collaborating to the creation of a new software for the use of ethics in institutions and organizations. But my collaboration is about the ethical content of the system. So it's actually fun to see people working in sense of writing the software and trying to turn whatever I say in ethics in some kind of mathematical formulas that can be used in software. This is a new experience, but it's not for now. I mean, this presentation is for survey. Now I'm actually wearing my old clothes of natural law theorist, and I'm going to talk about the good atheist, so-called, and natural law theory. And the title of this paper comes from a section of an article that Martin von Einer recently published in Italian, and in which he criticized me. And this goes back to actually the way I categorized him in one book I wrote in between 1996 and 2003. I can't remember when it was published, the English version of this. So it's called God and the Natural Law. In this book, I was claiming that there is still, I would call it a curse, but let's say it's a trend I notice in contemporary natural theorists who claim to be Thomistic, who claim to pretty much interpret Aquinas, so at least taking their first approach to natural theory from Aquinas. And that to me sounds like a new anti-nominalism. And let me explain briefly what I mean by that, and then I try to address Reiner's criticism. Since the beginning of this last millennium, the second, we had this debate. I mean, it started with William Locke and Gregory Rimini. The debate was about natural law being either just an arbitrary command by God, and by arbitrary means that God can command whatever he wants. So for a while, there were people trying to understand, so can God even command us to hate him? So we would be obligated to hate him, to be faithful to natural law. So people were trying to figure if all of the commandments, or just some of them, or which ones could be just turned over by just God's command. So natural law seemed to be, to some of these people called nominalists, followers of William Locke, as an arbitrary command by God. And the reaction was to focus on nature. So nature is God's wisdom. So somehow the truth of morality is inside nature. And the way to, even at that time, way before Grotius, just many people will think that the idea of an ethics without God came in modern time to Grotius, but actually this goes back to Gregory Rimini. And it's a post-Aquinas debate in history. So, and amazingly enough, because for what I'm going to say, it's a huge misunderstanding, amazingly enough, natural law theory that came after Aquinas. So Gregory Rimini, for the first time in history, said even if God didn't exist, natural law would still hold because of its grounding in nature. So this debate was the debate between nominalists and anti-nominalists, and portrayed natural law in a way that became, in a sense, a curse to me in natural law history. Because at that point, people thought that putting God into the picture meant to turn into sort of command theory in which we are supposed to be obligated just by a precept, which is kind of external. It's almost a frustration of our freedom. Or we can actually focus just on nature and we don't need God anymore into the picture. So in modern time, this is being framed mostly in terms of autonomy, moral autonomy. So when the moral norm is just grounded on nature, but without God, in a sense, that was the trend in modern time, it's called an autonomous morality, grounded on nature. So it makes sense compared to our nature. Our nature is not frustrated by an external command. Otherwise, it's called heteronomy because from Greek, autos means it's the same noun inside. Hetero is other for me. Autos would be me, hetero. So heteronomy is a Greek term in a sense, turning to our contemporary languages. So the norm of morality is not in me, it's somewhere else. And I'm just receiving this norm and I can obey out of an act of obedience. But maybe the norm doesn't have anything to do with my nature. So, and today this debate also became and we are, of course, we have to deal with the society in which there are many people who are very good people, apparently, at least. I mean, some of them are really good people, and they are atheists, or they claim to be atheists. And so should we tell them that somehow they are evil because they don't believe in God, or somehow natural law applies to them too? So, and Reiner likes to frame this as the idea of a good natural law morality for atheists. So it's possible, this is how he actually named this section, this article. Is a natural morality possible for the atheists, or something like that? I'm translating from this Italian article. The reason why I don't have the English translation is that I'm not sure he published this in English too. I need to ask him, but I didn't have enough time for it. So, and I call this a curse because I don't think this matches Aquinas at all. But it's still, that's the curse. It's still framed in a very old-fashioned way. So, for example, Reiner would say something like this. That the true moral autonomy leads to a freedom which is not given by doing good or avoiding evil only because it's commanded by God. So it's the old idea of the command theory, which is his thinking of. And then he tells me something that, to me, and this is my, Reiner and I think, don't share many key points in metaphysics, but what raised my interest in his recent piece is the way he addresses my mistake from his viewpoint as a mistake between the theory or doctrine of natural law and the reality of natural law in history. So he claims that I made this mistake. I am confusing a level in which when we try to work on the theory of natural law, we need to ground this theory also metaphysically. And we need also the existence of God as the foundation of this theory. But then natural law, as it exists in real people, in our lives, in ourselves, doesn't need reference to God because it can be understood, the precepts, in a sense, of natural law can be understood by our reason, and they are inside us. They are and he, of course, is grounding on Aquinas' idea that every inclination of our human nature is grasped by us as something to be done. So it's something that is matching our moral duties. So, for him, the idea of being autonomous for morality is the key. So morality cannot be something outside our existence. So he even raised the issue, so does natural law exist in the atheists? Is a sort of polemical question. And to me, of course, this is even a question that cannot be raised by anybody I know in the debate. I mean, because the problem is not if the natural law exists. If it is natural law, of course it exists the same way in everybody. The problem is how much you grasp of natural law at the reflexive level, and you can conform your actions to this natural law. But the idea that he criticizes me because somehow I'm too intellectualistic, I'm just working on the level of theory. Actually, it was it was a kind of intellectual shock to me, because I think that my personal history in natural law theory is quite the opposite. The reason why I've always been uncomfortable with the idea of an ethics without God is precisely because I don't see it in two kind of experiences. If my experience as a Catholic person and in my moral experience. So this is my first way of being uncomfortable with the idea of the atheist being perfectly in harmony with natural law, being atheist. So and this is what I want to focus on. I mean, this experience. And by the way, I'm extremely Aristotelian, I think, here, because to me, ethics truly is either autonomous or it's nothing. So I agree with the idea that heteronomy would make, a real heteronomy would make morality not interesting for us. It's not applicable. It would be like teaching math to a dog. So the dog is not capable of mathematics, so it's useless to talk to a dog. But if there is something in me that is there, and I understand it as some kind of ambition, aspiration, even a moral conscience issue, it means that I'm not indifferent. There's something in me which makes it relevant. And this is what we call autonomy in morality. So the real question is God part of our moral experience or not? So as a Catholic person and as a reader of Aquinas, of course, I mean, the first portrait of natural law theory for me is the Ten Commandments, right? The first part of the commandments is all about God. And so if natural law theory can do without God, we need to cancel the first table of the law. It means that we don't need it to be good people in this earth. So we just need the second part. But does this make sense? I just out of all the possible, quotations by Aquinas, I took this one, which he has to deal with the objection that maybe natural law can be summarized by loving our neighbor. And I chose this quotation because John Finis used this quotation in his book on Aquinas to show that actually we don't need God into this picture, which is funny, because this quotation in this part of Aquinas' work is Summa Theologiae, the first part of the second part, question 99, article 1, reply to objection 2, his point is exactly the opposite. He's trying to say that precisely because there is this way of summarizing natural law, this makes sense only if we understand that this is done under the umbrella of loving God. And so I'm reading this for you because it's been used in this debate on the other side. I claim that Finis too, of course, is a new anti-nominalist. He's one of the people I grouped into this kind of contemporary trend. So this is Aquinas. Whether the old law, this is the key, the question, whether the old law contains only one precept. Objection 2 reads this way. Further, the apostle says, Romans, letter to Romans, if there be any other commandment, it is comprised in this word, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But this is only one commandment. Therefore, the old law contained but one commandment. And this is the reply. As the apostle says, the end of the commandment is charity, since every law aims at establishing friendship either between man and man or between man and God. Wherefore the whole law is comprised in this one commandment. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, as expressed in the end of all commandments, because love of one's neighbor includes love of God, when we love our neighbor for God's sake. Hence the apostles put this commandment in place of the two, which are about the love of God and of our neighbor, and of which our Lord said, on these two commandments depends the whole law and the prophets. So Aquinas here reminds us of the real ultimate end of natural law, which is, loving everything for God's sake. So we can summarize natural law using just the second part of the 10 Commandments, if we understand that we love our neighbor for God's sake. So the ultimate end is still God. And I wonder how even John Finney, who is usually very precise when he quotes Aquinas, missed the sense of this quotation of Aquinas. It's exactly the opposite of what he does in his book on Aquinas. But Aquinas is extremely clear on one thing, and this is my main, I think that our faith, the natural law is revealed, doesn't make sense if we remove the part on God. But besides that, Aquinas' approach on natural law theory is grounded on the idea that we are not indifferent to God. So God is not like we need an heteronomy or a metaphysical foundation, because this is the typical sentence that you will find, to me, in the new anti-nominalists. They claim that you need God in morality, but there's a metaphysical foundation. That's it. But this is not part of our autonomy as ethical beings. And I agree with them on the concept of autonomy. I truly think, and I think I'm very Aristotelian, ethics is about desire. It's a reasoning desire. It's an intellect desiring something. So if we don't have the desire aspect, there is no morality. So everything would be an heteronomous, arbitrary command, a frustration of my freedom. But the key question for morality is, am I indifferent to something or not? If I'm not indifferent, there is an autonomous principle in me, an inclination of my nature, which I understand eventually as a moral duty and a moral commitment. So what is, and I have another, I replied to Romainer in a book in Italy recently. And I was surprised also about some of his examples, because he mentioned some evident truth in morality in history, and among this truth he mentions, for example, let me take this quotation. Okay, he mentions exactly as self-evident truth in morality, which are shown to be truth in history. And he mentions killing the innocent, adultery, lying, stealing, hating the neighbor, being envious, detraction or slander, and calumny. And I was curious, why detraction and not curse or blasphemy, for example? I mean, what is more evident in history? That people shouldn't detract, or doing some defamation. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I think it's clear enough. Or that they see blasphemy something evil, something bad. So my point is that, are we really indifferent to God? When we talk to other people, to the atheist, to the good atheist, are we forcing something that doesn't belong to his nature? And we are trying to talk about metaphysical foundation? To me, the moral life, when we look at our autonomy, our inclinations compared to God, actually God appears not only as the main point in our moral life, but as the umbrella point, is the highest, most important issue. If we deny his existence, we are actually almost destroying our entire self. And this is actually contemporary atheists. Sartre was sure about that. We are doomed, in a sense, this way. In a sense, we are destroying our deepest aspiration. What is it that we really want in life? We want to live forever. We want eternal life. What is it? Where is it? I mean, can we really understand who we are, what we really like in this life? If we don't project ourselves beyond this life through something that people call God, this is the way in which Aquinas ends all the 5 ways to the existence of God. And this is what we call God. This is what we call God. What is it? Is absolute perfection, is bounty, is something that exists without changing, without deteriorating. All these things that we notice, we grasp these ideas from this world, but we project this to what we really want. So we are beings who want something really strong that doesn't belong to this earth. It belongs to something that goes beyond this earth. If it doesn't exist, we are doomed, we are weird, we are freak. But we cannot say that we are indifferent to it. And I even object finished once. I mean, how can you say that we don't have an objective hierarchy in morality? If you look at our moral experience, our inclinations, of course we have several inclinations. We are complex beings. We need to eat. We need we need friendship. You know, this is how Gilson answered one of these questions about self-evident moral truth. A scholar, a student at a conference asked him, "So can you give me an example of self-evident truth?" And maybe he had an argument about the first principle of theoretical truth, right? Non-contradiction. But his answer, just probably to stop the discussion, was sure, self-evident truth. We need friends. Self-evident truth of morality. Can you show me that you don't need any friends? So he wouldn't even answer my question right now, because friendship is our social nature. We are here today because we need truth and friendship. We are social. So we have several inclinations, but clearly these inclinations have in order, a hierarchy, and the top level is God. So if I'm talking to an atheist, the best way for me to talk to him or her is to focus on what really her heart wants. And understanding that if God exists, clearly he's the most important thing. We might die even right now just to go to eternal life with him. So everything is, there is nothing absolute in this world. Think about it this way. There is nothing absolute. Why shouldn't I kill a mortal? I mean, if somebody is mortal, why is absolutely wrong to kill a mortal being? How can you explain that? This is not just a metaphysical foundation. This is me dealing with what I have to do, even dying for it. Why would I die for a moral truth if there is nothing beyond that? Why people convert when they're close to death? So the point is that to deny that God is autonomous in our moral nature and not natural law starts with the precepts about God and then goes down to the other precepts about everything else in a hierarchical order, I think is to misunderstand our entire structure of moral reasoning, which requires, especially in key circumstances in our lives, an absolute answer. So technically, I would challenge any friend of mine to explain to me why, without God, without any transcendent source, it is absolutely bad to kill a mortal. Or to do anything by it. I mean, why would it be really evil? So our inclinations, of course, makes us grasp something as morally good, but not as the most important good ever. So usually in life, everything can be turned the other way around by many other circumstances. But when we face an absolute act, which is intrinsically evil, okay, we need usually a higher, even think of our aspiration to justice. Everybody, even facing injustice in this life, would kind of find comfort in thinking that there is an absolute justice beyond this life. And this is the history of also civilization, which is mixing religion and morality, because we are, morally speaking, we are religious beings. Which, by the way, is something that I think John Paul II tried to stress many times. We are religious beings. It's part of our natural law. So, to me, this criticism by Ronheimer is almost unintelligible. I think that, and this would be my main. How much time do we have?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. So this will be my closing point. That I think that it's correct to react to both the nominalists and the anti-nominalists. I mean, it's true that a command theory is wrong. When we look at the world, we don't, and let's say that we are the perfect natural law beings, right? So when we look at this world and we see God beyond it, like in a transparent, windows, everything is transparent here. It is God, creating everything, holding it into existence. When I have this intellectual understanding, which can be spontaneous for many people. It's not like I obey what I understand about this world because it's a command in the sense of a precept which is away from me. It's just that since I'm inclined to love God above myself and with a greater love, I'm quoting Aquinas here, who says that if we didn't do that, naturally, our nature will be perverted. So grace should destroy our nature in order to make us Catholic Christians. So his point, this is actually a very good quotation, I have it here, but if we have a few seconds, I'll read it. But he's clearly saying that if our nature that is not inclined to do this, to put God as the highest good, and to love everything for his sake, our nature would be perverted, so naturally corrupted. The idea of being destroyed by grace is actually a very powerful image. I don't think Aquinas was playing with words. I mean, he knew exactly what he was doing. So, and he uses this argument of natural desire for God, even when he talks about our beatitude, our vision of God. I mean, I'm sure you remember these passages. So, but my main point is that it's true that command theory is wrong, is a false picture of a relationship with God. But if we see nature as created by God and we see his loving act of creation behind everything, the reason why we obey him, obedience is a good term, but it's an act of reason that is due to the fact that we love the creator of the castle. I mean, we love the castle, we love him, so we can see that everything we do in the castle, we put everything in the right place, is an act of obedience to his want, is what he wants. When you love somebody, you love what he loves. That in terms of will, love/will is the same thing. So command theory is wrong, but ethics without God is the wrong reaction to it. It's not just the right way to deal with atheists. It's telling them you can be perfectly as good as everybody else if you are just an atheist who follows natural law. No, if he's atheist, he's missing a little part of natural law, which is really crucial. And sometimes he's not really missing this part, he's just changing it into something else, like idolatry for something, like, you know, there are other mistakes in natural theory that comes from atheism, even though from several respects, atheists can be great people, of course, and I'm sure everybody in this room knows some very good atheists. Okay, that's it.
This remember this Huntington experience is known as speed dating Thomism, okay? So I'm trying to hold to the time. Next speaker is Roberta Bayer. I've got to know her over any and I'm looking forward to her talk on Aristotle and natural law. So we go.
Yes, this paper is actually on a most interesting 18th century figure. So I'm taking the same argument, thank you very much. We're taking the same argument back into the 18th century, where James Wilson, a framer of the Constitution, made an argument for natural law against the command theory, as you put it. So this is James Wilson, and I'm just going to explain his thought to you. Well, he was a constitutional framer. He lived 1742 to 1798. He is one of only 6 men to sign both Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, thoroughgoing evolutionary. He was an extremely important participant in the Constitutional Convention and a justice on the first Supreme Court. And Wilson made a much more philosophical argument about the natural law basis of democracy than any other framer. He argued that the precepts of natural law are known through our moral sense or conscience, the same concept basically as Thomas's synderesis. Secondly, he argued that law is not a positive rule of acting, nor a rule of action prescribed by a superior to an inferior, but communicated to moral sense and conscience through God's eternal and divine law. As such, he quite consciously rejected the positivism of Hobbes, Blackstone, Grotius. Okay, well, why? Who is this man? Well, he was born in Scotland and educated at St. Andrews in the common or moral sense. school of thought of Francis Hutcheson and Thomas Reid, its chief proponents. Now, Reid was very critical of Hume. In university, Wilson read all the moderns, philosophers, and a great many of the ancients, of course, and his library was one of the largest in the colonies. So his philosophical writings are something of an anomaly. His critique of Locke's epistemology probably was beyond the general understanding of most of his listeners, and I think that's why his works fell from favor after his death. In the 20th century, there has been renewed interest in Wilson, and commentators have alternately presented him as an Aristotelian, a Thomist through Suarez, and of course others have emphasized that Scottish education. And I think that this points rather interestingly to his place in the history of thought and the complexity of his thought. Now, first, just a few words about Hutcheson and Reid. Now, Alasdair MacIntyre has argued that Hutcheson was an Aristotelian, a late Aristotelian, in his book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality? And also, there are various historians of the Scottish universities of this period. One particularly interesting, George Elder Davies, who talks about this whole period as a revival of classical learning. I guess at the beginning of this period, university reformers decided that all Scottish universities should have a common curriculum like that of the medieval university. Why? Well, they wanted to distinguish their universities from English universities. Remember, there was an act of union in 1707, a political union, and there was therefore a conscious desire to make Scottish culture different. And so, as MacIntyre says, it's his words, they wanted to inculcate habits of mind appropriate to a culture in which the tasks of rational justification by appeal to principles with an authority independent of the social order were central. So to be capable of intelligently explaining to the world their ideas from first and common principles. Thus, of course, James Wilson came from a society where, as MacIntyre puts it, philosophy had a cultural hegemony. And this was in evidence during the years of 1790 to 1792, when Wilson gave a series of lectures at the College of Philadelphia, now University of Pennsylvania, on the first principles of law. Relying heavily on Reid and Hutcheson for his epistemology, he relied upon the Anglican divine Richard Hooker, 1558 to 1600, who wrote a very important scholastic defense of law, very Thomistic, as many people have commented, called the Laws of the Ecclesiastical Polity. So this combination of Hooker's scholastic metaphysics and Reidian moral philosophy forms the basis of his lectures. And it's original to him, I think. Reid and Hutcheson did not use Hooker. So this is his, I think, contribution. Okay, he argues for common sense republicanism, common sense, in a Scottish common sense, as the foundation of republicanism. Common sense, Wilson wrote, is that degree of judgment which is to be expected in men of common education and common understanding. Note the emphasis on education and understanding. People have in their conscience or moral sense communes notitiae, the common notions and practical principles of virtue common to all mankind. Unquote. Planted in the mind by God, this power is capable of culture and improvement by habit, frequent and extensive exercise. Now, because reason is a movement, as Thomas would say, it requires an end. Wilson agrees. Wilson says, conscience or moral sense determines the end which he ought to pursue. And he has intuitive evidence that this end is good, but the means of attaining this end must be determined by reason. Thus, quote, a magistrate knows it is his duty to promote the good of the commonwealth, but he does not do his duty without reasoning accurately, of course, which plan is best. Thus, quote, though good and ill, right and wrong are ultimately perceived by the moral sense, yet reason assists its operations and in many instances strengthens and extends its influence, unquote. That's the relationship. And finally, showing, of course, he is entirely a Christian of that period. He says, reason and conscience have further support, and that comes from Holy Scriptures. The moral precepts delivered in the sacred oracles form a part of the law of nature and are of the same origin and of the same obligation, operating universally and perpetually. It's reminding us of, reminding us somewhat of that relationship in Thomas. So he says, religion and law are twin sisters. Now, for him, natural law is the only possible philosophical foundation for democracy, because it provides that higher law to which legislatures must be beholden. Why is this the foundation? Because the original sovereignty, because we know higher law, original sovereignty lies in each one of us. So therefore, the principle of consent operates. Laws are not, therefore, which public approbation hath not made so. He's quoting Hooker there. Laws human of whatsoever kind are available by consent. So the Republic is built on common sense knowledge of the first precepts of the law. Okay, now the metaphysical foundation. Richard Hooker provided the metaphysical foundation. Now, Wilson, summarizing Hooker, wrote, quote, God's law is a law more distinguished by the goodness than the power of its gracious author. And you see here Platonism. Hooker had opposed, of course, the divine voluntarism of the Puritans, extremely important for the Church. And Hooker had said, they err, therefore, who think that in the will of God to do this or that, there is no reason beside his will. And Wilson, echoing Hooker, wrote, the supposition cannot be made that infinite goodness could be restrained from almighty power. God is infinite power, infinite wisdom, infinite goodness. So obviously you see here the medieval understanding of God and the rejection of the Occam and the tradition that follows from that. Anyway, Wilson wrote, laws may be promulgated by reason and conscience, the divine monitors within us, for in this manner they may be said to be engraven by God on the hearts of men. In this matter, he is the promulgator as well as the author of natural law. He's the teacher and the author. Laws are divided into these kinds, says Wilson, law eternal, which is the law of God unto himself, the law celestial, by which God governs the angels in heaven, the laws of nature, of course, which govern the rational and inanimate parts of creation, and also the law which man makes for man, communicated by reason and conscience. Now, here is his argument against Locke. Wilson's argument for self-government rests on a very different epistemology and metaphysic than Locke. And this is crucially important because so many people just read the framers as Lockeans, and Wilson just is clearly not a Lockean. Now, Wilson has been called a philosophical realist by some. Now, Locke, it was not, Wilson did not like Locke because Wilson reads Locke as a man of ideas, means he reads him as a kind of idealist. Wherein ideas mean skepticism as to the possibility that first principles of being are directly intuited by the mind. So for Wilson, the common sense world is the real world, etc. The first principles of being are directly intuited. Now, Locke had denied the existence of first principles in his essay concerning understanding. Right. Wilson followed Reid in saying that the mind is therefore not simply just a holding place for ideas in the Lockean sense, right? It actually has its own principles for within. For Locke, the mind gains ideas from the world around them, then sorts them out and examines them by reason, deciding what is true and untrue. This is because for Locke, we only perceive resemblances, not the thing itself. But can this be, said Wilson? No. Do you perceive me, or do you only perceive in your own minds an image or picture of me? If the latter is the case, that it is quite impossible to ever trust sense evidence. And consequently, you can never have any knowledge. In other words, you end up being a skeptic. So he argued against modern philosophy because modern philosophy ends up with the mind being entirely caught up in itself. Nothing outside of it can ever be known. And so he says, the modern philosophy gave rise to two different sects. At the head of one are Berkeley and Hume. At the head of the other are Hartley and Priestley. In the extension of Mr. Locke's principles, the Bishop of Cloyne, that's Berkeley, conceived that he saw reason to deny the reality of matter and to resolve all existence into mind. In his own sublime language, he thought he discovered that all the choir of heaven and furniture of earth, all those bodies that compose the frame of the universe, are merely ideas and exist only in the mind. Mr. Hume, proceeding on the same principles of reasoning, advances boldly a step farther. He thinks he sees reason for denying the existence of mind as well as matter. He annihilates spirit as well as body and reduces mankind, I use his own words, to a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. And Wilson continued, I am persuaded that absolute skepticism is not more destructive of the faith of a Christian than the science of a philosopher and the prudence of a man of understanding. So you simply cannot adopt this Humean epistemology, this Lockean-based epistemology, because it will destroy even the prudence of the man of understanding. And why is it destructive of prudence? Well, his answer is very simple. How could a court of law determine justice if consciousness is denied the ability to furnish accurate knowledges from the senses? He joked that if the senses are not a beginning point for certainty, perhaps lawyers should give up the trade. Right. So you simply can't run a court of law on skeptical epistemology. And he makes this very clear, especially in his big chapter on evidence. So that is his argument against Locke. I will move on now to just showing very briefly his understanding of the sociability of mankind, again marking him as an Aristotelian. He says, original perceptions uniting sense knowledge with moral sense stand at the very basis of society. Wilson, following his Scottish teachers, argued that men are drawn together into society by nature. Man is a political animal. He says, quote, the author of our existence intended us to be social beings and has for that end given us social intellectual powers. They are original parts of our constitution. Our social intellectual operations appear early in life and before we are capable of reasoning. Yet they suppose a conviction of the existence of other intelligent social beings. A child asks a question of his nurse and waits for her answer. This implies a conviction that she is intelligent and social, that she can receive and return a communication of thoughts and sentiments. If our natural state were simply solitary, such qualities simply wouldn't exist in us because they would have no use. Thus, making promises, keeping them, is deeply laid in our nature and in use in society without recourse to governmental law. The family exists prior to the state. He says society, of course, is natural. It can exist without government, although in our day, government is necessary to the flourishing of society by establishing the conditions for peace and public happiness of society. Government, of course, depends upon consent and is an addition to the natural order. And of course, this is very different from the social contract theory for obvious reasons. In the social contract theory, sovereignty is placed finally and completely in the artificial sovereign or parliament created by contract, whether you're looking at Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau. The philosophy of the Middle Ages, to which he's referring, of course, the natural law philosophy, viewed republicanism as based upon a higher law. There was the old adage from Roman law, what touches all should be approved by all. And of course, medieval republicanism saw the law of nature as stemming from a God who has implanted in man a desire for happiness, which must be sought in God's way and not in man's way, and which creates, of course, the foundation for consent. How am I doing?
We got a half an hour left.
No, sorry. Okay, I'm just going to
4
finish.
minutes.
I'm going to finish up. I will jump very quickly to bring this forward to Gilles Sonne. This brings me back to the topic of this conference. Now, for Wilson, of course, a people are free and equal by nature, by virtue of their common sense. If, however, it is thought that they have an original sovereignty by virtue of a higher law from God, a contract will simply be an act by which they choose a government. They don't alienate all their freedom. Unless there is a natural law to which the government is beholden, the people, of course, have lost their freedom. That's his argument. So philosophical skepticism is not a recipe for freedom. Now, Etienne Gilles Sonne drew attention to the same fact in a lecture he gave at Rutgers University in 1951 entitled Dogmatism and Tolerance. And here, of course, he said much of the same. He said that the true democratic state is one that recognizes the presence in human beings of something that is outside of the state, above the state, and which I may say became necessary to protect against the encroachments of the state. Whereas the totalitarian society is a form of society that sets no moral limits on the state. So his whole argument of the argument was that dogmatic truths will preserve and not harm the freedom of the individuals. He says, we are better off when people agree that some propositions are not merely probably or practically certain, but unconditionally true. And of course, who's he arguing against? He's arguing against Bertrand Russell, who had said that the democracy can only depend upon relativism. So, of course, Gilson says the state can't enforce truth. If it enforced truth, it would be the enemy of freedom. But on the other hand, to enforce relativism is also the enemy of freedom. Because the end of philosophy is not to enforce truth, but to relieve people, to allow them to reason properly from believing so they won't believe propaganda. And this in deliberation is only achieved by the examination of questions freely asked through our intellect. He says people are much more likely to maintain political freedom if most people dogmatically hold Marx and Hitler are wrong. So therefore, he says, a society cannot be taught that should not be taught that one should be skeptical of truth. That's the way to despotism. And of course, Wilson is writing his lectures on law in order to say precisely the same thing, which is that you actually need a philosophical education in order to understand what the nature of law is and to preserve a democracy. And you see the same argument in Gilles Sonne. So it's a continuing argument. And as my conclusion is that each generation has to argue against skepticism. It's just something we have to do, and it's part of our educational responsibility.
Thank you. Well, let's get both up the questions. Come on up. Most of us have questions. All right. Sebastian, go ahead.
Well, I've got one. If every generation has to argue against skepticism, are we always in danger of backsliding? Can't we build upon the success of the previous generation?
I think the difficulty is, here you are living in one thinks of Wilson in the 18th century, one thinks of the arguments that came forth in the Reformation that Hooker had to argue against. And of course there's Occam. It does seem to me that there is an argument that there is a predisposition to think that skepticism is a way to freedom, which is in the West, and it's just there. And so if you're going to make an argument against it, you actually have to go back to Aristotelian principles and argue Aristotle against it, because we just have these rival versions. As McIntyre would say we actually have three rival versions now. And his argument is always, of course, that Aristotelianism is the best because it provides more answers, right? It can answer the questions the skeptics answer better than the skeptics can answer them themselves. So yes, it's an ongoing argument.
Questions?
Yes.
Yes, if there's, the anonymous raised this idea that the God could have arbitrarily commanded completely different conduct from us. And if the argument to that is that no, the moral law is grounded in nature, does that just then move the question back to, could God then have created a different nature, which would have the same result as far as what our standard of conduct could be? In other words, that would be a different, you could have created a different nature in which everything would be, the moral commands would be the reverse. Does that come up as an argument?
Well, yes, I need to go back to several notes to find all the specifics. Right now, just for fun, it comes to my mind Chesterton, who one of my favorite literature pieces of literature, when he asked, in a kind of polemical way to scientists, why water, keeps falling down? I mean, because it's magic. So his point was that at the end of the day, scientists would not know why water really flows this way, because God actually is behind it. He made the entire world in a consistent way with this kind of natural law. You could know the fact that it works this way in a consistent way with all the other laws in nature, but at the end of the day, the water goes this way because God created the world this way, and there are other possible worlds He didn't create. I think that morally speaking, the wisdom of God is in the way love informs everything in a wise way. So hate and love would be the real crucial point. But there are aspects of our nature that might actually, I don't know, we might argue they might work slightly different if some other natural laws would be different. But as far as respecting one another, respecting who we are, because at the end of the day, even respecting private property is respecting the person, what the person needs. Of course, if we don't need private property for some reason in a different world, that wouldn't be part of the 10 Commandments. Not because it would be irrational, but because it's not in the circumstances of our existence. But, we should imagine possible worlds for it. But in this world, the way we are made, everything is consistent. It's a design of wisdom, and respecting the person for the sake of the Creator requires a lot of other things which are part of his wisdom. So, and that's why, putting his wisdom against his will is the key, sin, in a sense, in that tradition. But for details about, this kind of possible worlds, I mean, if I need to go back to some,
Curtis?
Yeah, Roberta, I agree with you that each generation has an obligation to take on the skeptics from the relatives too, which is the kind of skepticism. But as far back as St. Augustine, Contra Academicos in the 4th century, he showed that skepticism is transparent, right? It's even self-refuting. And that goes even for your gaunt and modern skeptics like Hume and Kant, which he subjected to examination, they collapse. So I suspect that skepticism isn't really about a philosophical theory of mind, more than a political device. You can get people to accept skepticism, and that will discourage them. They'll not engage in rational debate, and the skeptics have an ideological, political agenda, and they dominate the culture. So I think skepticism is smokescreen.
But yes, but Hume actually, the Hume and Locke actually moved apart philosophical arguments against it. And that, of course, is a great part of Hume's lead, is to actually show that why Hume's Well, they were friends, right? Why Hume, the presupposition of Hume were wrong, because Hume was, of course, articulating at a very high level this level of skepticism. So, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't. It's just it certainly has a political appeal, but there's also the fact that Hume, of course, gives birth to, gives way to James Stuart Mill and James Stuart Mill and John Stuart Mill, so that you end up having a line of teachers coming out of law, which of course Wilson identifies, this line of learning coming out of law, which is, and this is his brilliance to see it in opposition to the line of learning that comes out of the Aristotelian tradition, and to see that they're actually in conflict, because the framers, for the most part, the other framers don't see this really very well at all, right? They're saying, oh, Locke is wonderful, contract theory is just great, and at the same time, they will be talking about natural rights, whereas Wilson's actually identifying the fact that we can't hold both sides together.
But by politics, I'm talking about the cultural indifference.
Yeah.
Academy establishment about skepticism. You go to an think philosophy department,
Yes.
they're awash in skepticism. They don't care. 2 centuries of criticizing human Trump. They're indifferent. They're not going to change. It's not about a philosophical argument. It's about a certain culture that
Yes.
will serve their purposes. That's what I suspect.
That's why Adler said that we're unteachable. They're like these sort of
Yeah, I concur.
I have a couple of questions. One would be related to Aristotle being a good atheist, in the sense that his Gilson in Divine Philosophy talks about how, in a way, Aristotle caused the death of Greek religion, because the unmoved move of Aristotle was unworshipable. In which case, strictly speaking, if you take this, the strict understanding of Aristotle, his whole moral teaching is based upon the fact that God does not exist, because you don't have a being that you really can worship, but the natural order, the organization of the universe is such that you have this natural inclination. And if you see him as it's coming out of this line from Plato, where the Greek gods are really bad, like beings, they can believe in cannibalism and wife beating and rape and so forth. Then wouldn't the natural inclination of the morally prudent person be to become, like Socrates is accused of being, at least a partial atheist in an ancient sense, or a complete atheist?
Well, I mean,
According to natural law.
this is there are so many things that come to my mind about this question. Okay, well, first of all, first of all, one thing is interpreting Aristotle's thought. The other thing is interpreting his culture, his relationship with Plato and Socrates. I think that they are all revolutionaries. They turn down the kind of cruel, and anthropomorphic idea of gods, and that's why Socrates died. So, but they didn't do that as atheists. They did it as actually very religious people. I think that their idea of God was much higher than their culture. That's why I have this amazing admiration for these scholars, because they were able to be so consistent to the point of dying and even creating revolutions. And this is a constant attitude in Greek philosophy. They were taking reason really seriously. They wanted to be consistent with the reason, even if it meant dying or challenging their entire culture. Like Epicurus did, having women in his group of philosophers, right, in the garden. So they were extremely consistent, and Socrates and Plato were extremely, in a sense, spiritual. I mean, they had an idea of a higher God, and so And of course, there is the entire also debate about what sort is meant by his demons, the conscience. Is it the demon was also a sign of a supernatural voice related to this conscience? But I think that Aristotle was no different than that. He was just, in a sense, the real analytic philosopher. He was the philosopher who didn't want, while philosophizing, saying anything more than what he, in a sense, was allowed to say, following that specific frame of reasoning he was following each time. So, whether he was right or wrong, he didn't want to go too far. And the best example is his proof for the existence of our immortal and spiritual. It's not spiritual, he didn't say that, right? Our soul is spiritual in the sense of not blended with the body. So he mentioned this, he kind of used the argument that in Aquinas becomes the argument for the spirituality of the soul, but without saying that, because all he would say is that according to his reasoning at that moment, our soul couldn't be blended with the body, so he needed a different act of existence using Aquinas' metaphysics terminology. But Aristotle has some, there are hints. First of all, I love Kevin Flannery's approach to Aristotle as having a different idea of God, even in morality. But even in the book on the soul, there are hints about the fact that everything involves God. I mean, everything is working according to the higher law for God. So, but in the metaphysics, we just find the only technical proof that he could see about the existence of God. So I think he was a perfectly rational person working with, his reason in a way that wouldn't affect his overall vision, Weltanschauung in a sense. But if you read the entire work, you will see the idea of a God which is actually higher and is a goal for not only humans, for the entire creation. So it's very natural law oriented. But when he has to speak about God technically, his only proof was the moved mover, and that's what he said, as he did with the human soul. I mean, he didn't even use a different term. I mean, that's so. I think that I think his culture, his vision, and we don't have his poetic writings. So maybe like Plato, he had different writings in which he was speaking differently. We have his technical writings. In the technical writings, I think he was consistent with this analytic approach. But there are hints in his work in which there is another idea of God, and I think they're extremely fascinating too.
The other question I had was related to whether or not there really is such a thing, such an animal as a social contract theorist. That is, aren't the, and to give a leading question, aren't they all really natural law theorists posing as cross-dressers in a way, that as if they're not, but they're holding that human beings are really rotten by nature, and they don't want you to know that they're holding their cards, so you can't see that they're, human beings are really sociopaths, and so you need the this repressive government to control.
But why would that be a natural law theory? That's
it's about human nature.
But that's not what natural law is. I mean, well, you can answer. I mean, it seems to me that the distinction is precisely what you said, which is the metaphysical foundation.
Right.
And that's what Wilson's argument is, right? Is that Blackstone supposedly is a natural law legal theorist. But Wilson said no. Why? Because he simply defines law as a superior laying down a law for an inferior, the command theory. That's Blackstone. But a command theory suggests it has no metaphysical foundation in which to make the command. So it ends up just being despotism.
Yeah, but it does have a metaphysical foundation. The metaphysical foundation is related to the nature of the human person.
It's just the will of the lawgiver. He cannot justify it. He has no metaphysical foundation for justifying.
Well, the metaphysics is one of an arbitrary will. It's not strictly speaking a philosophical metaphysics. It's sophistic. Huh?
Oh, well,
but
okay.
in other words, underlying both is an understanding of the human person. But in order to kind of sanitize and hide this from the people and appear to have an enlightenment and scientific attitude toward politics. They say, well, we don't hold an understanding of human nature underlying. What we hold is we've got this grandiose scientific understanding of the way laws work and interact, and we call this social contract, and it's somehow emerged out of the history of consciousness or something.
Well,
There's no natures in things.
On
But
a
they already
different
slipped it
level, on a
in.
different level, they usually like to claim ownership on, I mean, not as me, as Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas on the concept, the social contract, because it was, I mean, we usually tend to think of the social contract just in modern time, but social contract is a term that is used both in theology and philosophy from Aristotle on. So we have this concept, and it's very important because it indicates that as social beings, whenever we live together somehow, there is an agreement behind that. I mean, so we agree about something. Otherwise, right now we are agreeing about several rules, many of them, hundreds of them, including the rules about, how to, give the word to each other. So there is a social contract there, which is an agreement, which at the very first level, and this is very Aristotelian, is an agreement about some basic goods or values that we share. So the rules of political community is actually sharing some key, goods and values. And I think that this is the key of a different social contract idea. And this is definitely there, which is different from law, right? But it grounds law.
Well,
Step by
it does,
step.
except that
Let's take one more question here.
Self-preservation.
Right.
Well, it's not actually a question, it's more just jumping into.
All right, jump in.
What's the cops? Because, these are the granddaddy stuff. He does have a natural law theory, in a sense. Well, I mean, if we look at what natural law theory is supposed to have, there are some inclinations that Tom talks about, there is some reasoning going on. And then you get, of course, the sovereign needs to be there, cautious all, and all this stuff. So, let me suggest this. What we have in commons, it's not a question of whether we do or don't have it. It's a question of whether we have an adequate. We have a very inadequate, which leads to this horrible social contract.
It's because it's very grounded.
Right.
Because it's grounded in simply reason about self-preservation.
Exactly. So he's not looking at the entire range of the right?
So there's no ground for natural law, apart from conservation of utility, of the utility of soil. Which means that you no longer have to body physically.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about, say, the basic precepts of natural law, Tom's getting one thing right, because they're wrong. Right? Of course, it doesn't apply to everybody else. So it's sort of, if we think about it in terms of political, what we have there is something analogous to how tyranny is a option of that's what's going on. It's saving law. I don't even know if you can say it yourself. As a natural law.
Well, it's the difference between saying, I'm sorry, I should go, there's a difference between saying for the older view that the highest that I'm choosing to enter into this contract because my end is good.
Yeah.
And the end is saying I'm entering into this contract in order to simply avoid it. But you see, that's the difference between having a good
I'm still saying,
and avoid the evil, which is a kind of negative.
Perhaps it's not just avoid evil, it's to avoid death, but it's also the hope by, having something there to attain a good what he's looking.
Right.
So there is some
because what is good for Thomas is eternal life. And I would say even for Wilson, it's eternal life. But for Hobbes, it's making sure I can stay alive and I have all these things, material goods that we need in order to live like he was.
Yeah.
It's historical experience.
Pardon?
It's historical experience of a very bad,
Yes. Right,
exactly.
Richard.
Follow up to the comment. If Thomas is said that many orders depend upon knowledge, the So how does Wilson create that? So if he's strictly philosophical.
Well, he isn't really. I mean, some of those quotations are very clear that he thinks that everything he's saying in philosophy and natural law philosophy is supported in scripture. So you see, what you've got in Scotland are Hutchison and Reed are both ministers of the church, the theologians. But they understand that in fact, you actually need to make philosophical arguments for the nature of your community. You can't just base it on Bible alone, right? They're called moderates and so consequently, you see they are making parallel arguments for philosophy, which they're not. So they're thinking theologically, but making the argument philosophically.
Just another thing from Gilson, Gilson also reminded us in third generation fighting skepticism, that he said there was something greater than the atomic bomb drop that was called Nietzsche, and God instead. And I think that's one of the culture when you realize this. I think postmodern culture, we live in the age of Nietzsche. It was a little deeper than skepticism.
Right. And Apple goes beyond that, saying it's the university professors.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that.
That's great. Let's go on.
Which would appear, by the way, it appears we can read online for free on JSTOR.
All right, I'm gonna mention
Similar to
it's just like. I guess we're gonna break for.
evening session.
Break for the dinners at 6.
Oh, it already stopped? Oh, I didn't.
I wonder when it's done. Oh, well, we'll find that out soon.
Like, is that like an error, like a crash that you stopped? Nobody pressed, I don't think I ever pressed.
How it was going, I was following it. Let's see if it's doing this.
Get back on.
Yeah, we'll be able to. Are we breaking now?
It's 42.
5:46. Yeah, see, so she was.
There's state stamp where it says.
When it's done.
Yeah.
We're gonna have the panel discussion at 7 o'clock back here after that.
Play the video and go to the end, get some idea. Oh, it's not this one, skip it.
No, it's still live. You can still see us, we're just not seeing ourselves. Oh, all right, well, we're signing off. We're gonna go to dinner, we'll be back here at what time? 7 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time.
It's very strange. I thought when shows like that it's no longer streaming.
Not right here, look, the thing is on behind the screen, so it's still fine.
Yeah, we should stop it now.
Yeah, it's not.